This is a DeLorean DMC-12. Whether it's time travel, embezzled government grants, or FBI cocaine stings, it's famous for lots of things. But least of all, what it's actually like as a car. So I'm going to try and dispel some of the myths around it and describe what it's actually like to own and drive one. First, let's take a look around. Obvious place to start is the doors. There hadn't been many other Gullwing cars when the DeLorean was developed. There'd been the Mercedes 300 SL and the Bricklin, but the technology required to actually open a door this heavy hadn't been developed to that point. So DeLorean had to go to Grumman Aerospace to help manufacture cryogenically the torsion bar that lifts the door up. And it was so complex that when DeLorean Motor Company Houston, which is the modern version of the company, tried to remanufacture them 35 years later, they couldn't actually find a company who was able to do it. Inside, it's a two-seater, leather and electric windows as standard. It'd be much better if it didn't have electric windows, to be honest, because they add weight and complexity to an already heavy and complex door. But John DeLorean met a random businessman on a plane, and he was convinced that any luxury car had to have electric windows. So despite the engineering stupidity of it, he put them in, and there you go. Behind the seats, there's enough room for a set of golf clubs. But what that also means is that it pushed the engine back sufficiently far. It became rear-engined rather than mid-engined, and much like an early 911, that means it can do without power steering. Glove box here, catch is out of a VW Sirocco. Ashtray out of the Porsche 924. In fact, one of the good things about trying to run one of these cars is the fact that most of the parts were off other stuff that was kicking around at the time. So the front brakes are off a Ford Cortina, for example. Coming around to the business end, the engine is a 2.8 V6 that originally saw life in Peugeots, Renaults and Volvos of the era. So things like the Renault 30, the Renault GTA, the Volvo 760. The engine was kicking around all the way up until the Renault Laguna, although by that point it had electronic fuel injection rather than the mechanical Bosch K-Jet that's on this. It was called underpowered by the press at the time, but that's mostly because the engine that went into the DeLorean was the federalized version of it, which was detuned for the American market and to meet the American emissions requirements. In federalized spec, it put out 130 horsepower. That's what the cars went all over to the States with. But in European spec, which is what this car is, it puts out 160 when combined with a stainless free-flow exhaust. So one of the rumours kicking around was that the other engine that was considered for the DeLorean was the V8 from the Porsche 928. That's not actually true. The only other engine that was considered, instead of the Renault unit, which is what the DeLorean ended up with, was the Alfa Romeo Busso V6. That would have sounded incredible, but can you imagine trying to run a DeLorean with an early 80s Alfa engine? So I've always loved the rear light design of a DeLorean, but had the car ever been sold in the UK, it would have had some really horrific units to fit whatever the legal requirements were at the time. I don't really know what was wrong with these because, you know, they work just the same, but there you go. The other thing that's a little bit odd is that the stainless letters that spell DeLorean didn't come with the car either, which is strange because the cutout holes are there for them and it looks so much better with them in, but there you go. So up front, there is the boot. It's quite shallow, but you can fit a surprising amount of crap in here. The strut brace is an extra. No idea if it actually makes any improvements or not. Underneath the carpet is a spare wheel well full of tools. And up front, we have where the jack should live, but instead, the essential piece of any classic car ownership, jump leads. Okay, let's go for a drive. And maybe let's address the first myth, performance. The DeLorean isn't maybe quite the disaster that it was made out to be. It ended up a little bit heavier than it was originally intended to be, but it's still only about 1270 kilos. That's about the same as a BMW era Mini. So with the stock 130 horsepower that the cars went to the States with, that was good for about 9.5 seconds to 60 in the manual, a little bit slower in the auto, and a top speed of about 120. But in a Euro spec car like this, which is what John DeLorean originally envisaged, 160 horsepower and 173 foot-pounds of torque will get you to 60 in a smidgen under 8 seconds and onto a top speed of 135 or so. Both of those I have actually verified. The first at Santa Pod, racing DeLorean against DeLorean there, and the second on the Autobahn with GPS. By modern standards, sure, a hot hatch goes quicker, but by the standards of the early 80s, that wasn't actually that bad. That was quicker than, say, a Maserati Merak and the BMW 635 CSI, and not much slower than a Jaguar XJS and a Porsche 928. Had the company survived another year or so, it's likely they'd have been able to get their twin-turbo version to market. This was being developed over in the States by a small engineering company called Legend, and prototype cars there were timed at 5.5 seconds to 60, running 250 horsepower. Had they actually been able to get the twin-turbo version to market, it would have been one of the fastest production cars on sale in the world. And the company's intention, had it survived, would have been to shift pretty much all the production of a DeLorean to the twin-turbo model and phase out the naturally aspirated one. However, with 250 horsepower, they might have also had to do a little bit of work to the suspension and the handling. So let's approach myth number 2, handling. Let's start with the ride, because that's an easy one. The ride's actually pretty good. On bumpy roads like this, the car moves around a bit underneath you, but it doesn't feel firm or harsh. This car's riding on upgraded Spax shocks, which help, but stock cars weren't too bad either. The downside, obviously, of a plush ride is body roll, and the DeLorean certainly does have some of that. But then again, in the early 80s, body roll was kind of an accepted part of driving. If you look at road tests from the era, you'll see cars leant right over. Even in manufacturers' advertising, you'd have cars with their high-profile tyres buckling under the rim and the body lurching to one side. If you look at pictures of a 2CV, they'd get it to 45 degrees. Steering. It has been said that you don't so much steer a DeLorean as aim it, and there is some truth in that. It's not the most accurate of racks. What it does give you, though, is feel. There's something that you get with a classic car and the way that the unpower assisted steering loads up under pressure that modern cars don't just give you. It is a physical experience for sure. The steering is pretty heavy, the clutch is heavy, the brakes aren't very heavily servo assisted, so need a lot of attention, but what you put into it you also get back, and that's one of the joys of driving a classic car, and driving a classic car quickly, is that it forces you to drive it well. You can't really get away with throwing it into corners too fast, you know, letting the car sort out your mistakes, because frankly it won't. Grip levels are pretty good. It's just started raining now, but despite driving the car fairly eagerly over the last 8 or 9 years, it's only a couple of times I've had the back step out on me, and when it does, it's been pretty easy to catch. The car runs on 235s at the back, pretty fat tyres for the time. The gearbox is pretty good too. The throw's quite short, although the ratios are quite long. Had the car made it to the UK, then it would have had a shorter final drive ratio. It is very much set up for maximum economy on the American freeways. So although the car sits on a Lotus Esprit chassis, which is a pretty good starting point, it doesn't actually have the same suspension setup as the Esprit. Notably on the front, you'd normally have a triangulated wishbone, basically meaning that if this is your chassis, here is your wishbone on it, held on in 2 places. And what that means is that as you brake or as you turn or with any load on the suspension, the wheel doesn't move about so much. In the DeLorean, unfortunately, it's only mounted in one place, and your lower control arm basically is fixed to the chassis at one point, and there's a couple of bushes that wobble about under pressure. And that means that your front wheels essentially go forwards and back when you're braking or whether you go over bumps, which means that you get brake steer, you get bump steer, and it can get a bit squirrely under load. There are a couple of things you can do to help with that. There are some aftermarket support brackets that reinforce that area and reduce it, but it's still in effect. The other part of the problem is at the back, you've got 2 rear trailing arms. But the way that they were designed, it means that as you basically load up one side as the car's rolling under pressure, let's say 70-mile-an-hour motorway slip road, as the car rolls, it introduces a little bit of toe-in, like rear wheel steer essentially, and the car starts to come round on you, or it feels like it's about to come round on you. It's quite unnerving. You're not about to lose the back end, but it feels like you might be. So at speeds of up to kind of 7/10 or so, the car's not too bad, but push it much harder than that, especially at high speeds, and it takes a slightly firmer grip and steelier balls. So, rattling on through the myths. Myth 3, the car is neither practical or reliable. Well, there's one way to test that, and that is to go on a road trip. This is now 4:45 in Manchester. I need to be in Folkestone by 10 o'clock. Let's see how practical it is for a trip to the Alps. So inside the car here we have a set of 186 skis and snowboard inside that bag. So that's taking up most of the passenger seat. Behind that, boot bag, pillow for when I need to sleep through the night because I'm broken down, and some food and a jacket. So it's sort of handling this okay. It would be difficult to do this trip with 2 people and the skis, unless I were to have one of the amazing roof racks that go with the louvre here, but that does make opening the louvre and having access to the engine bay rather difficult. One final check I will just do is to the fluids. So, in particular the coolant, to make sure that before I get onto the motorway, we're doing okay. Let's have a look. So the coolant looks okay. Oil I checked last night. I think this is an engine that is good to go. Let's get in the car and get on the road. So the first quirk of fueling a DeLorean is that the fuel filler is actually underneath the bonnet. So you have to open the bonnet. Here's the fuel filler. Just had a guy recording a Snapchat, getting into the car because he loved it so much. Often happens at petrol stations. That's done. So on the reliability front, there are a couple of things I can touch onto straight away. Let's have a look at the dashboard. There's 2 things you'll notice. Well, probably one thing you'll immediately notice, and the first is that the speedo doesn't work. This is standard because DeLoreans use an angle drive system to give you your speedo reading, and what that means is that there's basically a piece of wire that spins around as fast as the wheels are rotating. So you can imagine how fast and how often and how much that thing spins around and then brakes. What this means is that most DeLoreans don't have a working speedo. And the other interesting thing about DeLorean reliability is touched into the voltmeter here. One of the things that was slightly half-assed about the engineering of the DeLorean as it came out of the factory was the rating of the alternator, which meant that as you applied electrical load to the system, what would happen was the alternator wasn't powerful enough to power your lights and your radio and your fans and the air conditioning and actually keep the battery topped up. The end result being that as you were driving along at night with these various electrical things on, you'd be depleting the battery to the degree where you'd get home, turn the car off, come to it the next morning, and it wouldn't start, it'd have a flat battery. Stroke of genius. Fortunately on this car it's sorted, but we can take a look at the voltage meter now and see what happens when we actually apply some electrical load to it. Okay, so here's our voltmeter reading just above 13 volts. Let's turn on the headlights. Let's turn on the fan. There it goes, it's dropped down even more. If I were to continue to add electrical load, we'd see that dial go straight down. The other thing that's important to remember when looking at reviewing any DeLorean is the condition it's in. And indeed any classic car that's 37 years old. It's had 37 years to fall apart. And depending on how well the car's been kept, it will drive badly or it will drive well. I mean, I've spent 10 years with this car, taking it from being a hell of a state and through rolling and not so rolling restorations, getting it to about as good as I can get it to be. And no matter how much work you've done to the car, you can't rule out one of the 1,000 things that makes the car tick doing something that you wouldn't expect. And I think the other thing that's important to remember about the era that the DeLorean came from is that cars then were shit. I mean, there's no getting around it. You know, you went into a dealer and asked for a sports car in 1981 Britain and you'd leave with a Triumph TR7, possibly a Ford Capri, or maybe if you were daring an Alfa Sud. And if you drove through a puddle on the way home, the chassis would have fallen out by the time you parked it on your driveway. You know, if you, like us, bought a nice new Rover SD1, within months the children will have peeled the back off the chairs and taken off the door handles because they'd just come off in your hand. You know, or maybe you got an Austin Princess or a Morris Marina. You know, cars from this era were just rubbish. And when you judge the DeLorean against those, suddenly the rubbishness of the DeLorean is actually, in context, not that bad. Yes, look at this guy. This is an Austin Maxi. There he goes. This is the kind of era of car we're talking about with the DeLorean. And look, he trusts his reliability so much he's got a spare wheel on his roof. Let's leave this Maxi behind, shall we? One of the things that you do get a lot of in a DeLorean are people sitting on your rear quarters taking pictures. I've got a van behind me right now who wants to come past. There's a pretty good chance he's going to sit there, maybe give me a thumbs up. He was filming. Of course he bloody was. So the car has safely made it to the Eurotunnel, and you can get a sense for just how low and wide it is relative to other cars when you see it in this kind of context. It only just fits in the tracks that the cars come down. So just got off the Eurotunnel, finally driving on the right side of the road for the car, being left-hand drive, and car is still running pretty smoothly. I don't want to jinx it, but touch wood, we have got this far. So 350 miles in, only about another 50 miles left tonight. Here we have it, the Premier Class. And it is time to go to bed. Let's see how she wants to start up on a cold morning. Pretty well. So we're now about half an hour away from Béthune, heading down towards Rheims and then Troyes. You'll have to forgive the French pronunciation there. Doing about 90 miles an hour, about just over 3,000 revs. Let's hope this continues and gets us down to Troyes for lunch. There we go, a little bit of péage action. There we go. So I made it to Troyes in time to fill up with fuel, which was another tank of 33 mpg, which over 80 miles an hour is pretty good. One small casualty though is the N off here. The stainless letter has fallen off, so it would appear that I am now driving DeLorean. So 750 miles into the trip, I've got through 2 and a bit tanks of fuel. I've averaged 33 miles per gallon at 85 miles an hour average. The seats are really comfortable, the ride is soft, it's tall geared, it's really quite a comfortable long distance companion. So we have just had our first reliability fail. The windscreen wiper on the left hand side has decided to deposit itself here. This isn't ideal for function, but on the plus side it did at that instant stop raining. Okay, so I have now stopped, but how do I open the door? Because if I open the door, I don't want to... No, it's going to be okay. I can twang it. This is ridiculous. 13mm sockets. Don't know if the socket wrench works, it could be broken. Let's move the wiper back down to where it's supposed to be. Back there. The DeLorean might just have been pulled over on the hard shoulder with its hazards on, but I am not going to class that as a breakdown. So the light is fading, but the roads are drying and emptying out. We're doing 4,200 revs at the moment in fifth, which is equivalent to about 110 miles an hour. As you can hear, the car's fine. It's actually happier at this speed than it is at about 80, I think, just due to the wheel balancing and anything else. If only everywhere was dry, straight, empty and smooth, this car would be delightful. So I don't want to count too many chickens just yet, but we have just gone past Moutier and we're about to ascend the hill up to Maribel. It shouldn't really be too much of a surprise, but yet somehow it always is a little bit when you make it a very long way in a DeLorean. It does suggest though that this can be counted as a success on the reliability front. let's talk a little bit about the myth of owning a DeLorean. It's got to be a bit of a nightmare, hasn't it? Well, actually not so much, because you've got a Renault engine and gearbox, a bunch of running gear from other cars of the era, simply because it was too difficult, too expensive, too time consuming to develop completely specific parts for the whole car at the time. And what specific parts you do have for the DeLorean are all pretty much still available, because the company went bust halfway through a production run, so there were still enough parts to build 3,000 complete more cars. And all of those parts are now owned by the DeLorean Motor Company in Houston, and you can buy them all. And they're not as expensive as, you know, parts for a contemporary Ferrari 308 or Porsche 928. I mean, if you need an indicator lens for a 308, you know, good luck having much change from 500 quid. Whereas in a DeLorean, it's probably the same, well, it is the same as the one off Lada Niva. So there you go, £2.50, job done. The car itself is pretty much like a Meccano set, so working on it's quite straightforward. Yeah, like any old car, there are frustrations when it comes to trying to take it apart and you find that bolts have seized, or you know, you need to drill something out, but that's going to be no difference on your MGB than it is to a DeLorean. The car runs on the same size tyres as the Lotus Esprit and Jaguar XJS, which you'd hope would mean they'd be easier to find nowadays, but you're kind of limited to a couple of choices. You've got general grabbers, which are a modern SUV tyre, or you can pay 250 quid for a Pirelli P600. Personally, I go for the grabbers, they're a more modern tyre. And what you've also got is an incredibly active and social owners club in DeLoreanclub.co.uk. And it's not just online with help and advice. The club are also incredibly proactive, not just about stocking parts, but also developing replacement parts that are often better than the original, whether it's ball joints or stainless steel door struts or stainless steel free flow exhaust systems. So there's a huge amount of support now when it comes to owning a DeLorean that there simply hasn't been at any point in the past. There's actually never been a better time to own and run one. We don't buy classic cars because they're objectively good in quantifiable categories. We buy them because of how they make us feel. And the DeLorean certainly makes you feel stuff. I mean, sometimes it's frequently anger, but the smile it puts on the kid's face in the back window of a car passing you on the motorway, waving at you because he's never seen one before. The smile it puts on the guy's face who comes running up to you in the petrol station wanting a picture because he's never seen one before in his life either. All of that stuff kind of makes owning it worthwhile. So, in conclusion, are all the myths true? Well, no, not really. But even if they were, it wouldn't really matter. It wouldn't make the car any less awesome.